Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we think about huge historical turning points, we're usually picturing epic battles or massive political speeches, right? But today, we're looking at something totally different. What if I told you that one of the absolute defining moments in the history of Africa's most populous nation literally came down to a ledger? We're going to trace the money and explore the invisible financial systems that built Nigeria's political landscape. Let's get right into it.
So, how did counting people lead to a military coup? I know, sounds like a trick question, doesn't it? But this is the exact historical mystery we're unpacking today. We're heading back to the early 1960s. And spoiler alert, a simple population headcount didn't just spark a little political disagreement, it completely shattered a nation's stability. To get why that happened, we actually have to look past the numbers themselves and focus on what those numbers secretly represented.
Section 1. The 1962 Census Crisis. All right, here is how the chaos unfolded. Back in 1952, the original population count gave the northern region a pretty massive majority, and in this system, that translated directly into majority control in the House of Representatives. But then, we hit the 1962 census, and for the very first time, the combined population of the South was reported to be higher than the North. Well, immediately, there were widespread accusations of ethnic bias, and the results were just canceled outright. So they ordered a recount in 1963, and the results flipped right back, putting the northern majority back in place. The sheer tension, the suspicion, and the political fallout from this one single administrative task, it laid the direct foundation for Nigeria's first military coup in 1966.
You really have to look at the absolute scale of this statistical reversal to believe it. In that canceled 1962 count, the northern region stood at 22.5 million. But in the 1963 recount, conducted by a British official, that number suddenly surged to nearly 29.8 million. Meanwhile, the eastern region stayed completely flat at 12.3 million, and the western region actually dropped a little bit. So you can see how dramatically the figures flipped to reinstate the North's demographic and therefore political dominance.
Moving on to Section 2, the power of population.
So, why did a few million extra people on a census report matter enough to literally topple a government? Well, it's because in this specific system, population figures weren't just demographic trivia, they were the absolute currency of power. Your population size determined how national revenue was shared. It decided the boundaries of political constituencies, and it dictated how many seats you got in parliament. Basically, a higher head count meant more money and more control. Once you realize that population literally equals the size of your slice of the federal financial pie, the absolute desperation to control those numbers makes total sense.
Section 3. Nigeria's Fiscal Federalism.
To really grasp the macro-level economic rules playing out here, we're pulling from some incredibly comprehensive research by the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, or CODISRIA. Their data is going to help us look objectively at how resources actually flow across the country.
These researchers focus a lot on a concept called federal presence. Simply put, this is the spatial distribution of federal expenditure. Basically, it's not just about abstract laws or policies in a capital city, it's a physical, on-the-ground measure of where the central government is dropping its money. Where are the universities being built? Where are the federal jobs located? Where do the massive health and infrastructure budgets actually end up? This federal spending acts as a huge channel of equity, or inequity, depending entirely on where that presence is actually felt.
And the reason that presence is such a big deal comes down to one absolutely massive number: 70%. Historically, like between 1987 and 1990, for example, this was the average portion of the total national expenditure that was retained by the central federal government, 70%. When the center holds on to that much of the wealth, especially when so much of it is generated by oil revenues, controlling that center becomes the ultimate high-stakes prize for literally any regional group.
Because the center hoards so much wealth, the fight for it cascades downwards into two totally different directions. First, you have vertical allocation. Think of this as the constant friction between the states and that all-powerful central government. And then there's horizontal allocation. This is a fierce lateral struggle among the states themselves, all fighting over the consolidated revenue that actually manages to trickle down. As the research points out, older principles like derivation, which basically means a region keeps a share of what it physically produces, were actually de-emphasized in the 1970s, and what replaced them? Principles based heavily on population and equality of states.
Which brings us to Section 4, competing for federal resources.
Scholars call this whole dynamic ethno-regional competition. Think about it. When the central government controls the oil wealth and hands it out based on headcount and local boundaries, stakeholders are logically going to mobilize their ethnic and regional identities to, well, secure that bag. It's basically a calculated economic strategy playing out on a political stage. Groups demand the redistribution of resources in their favor, or they fiercely resist giving up the economic and political power they already have.
If you want to see how this plays out geographically, look at the stark contrast between Kano State up in the north and Delta State down in the south-south. Check this out. Delta State accounts for roughly 35% of the nation's total oil and gas revenue, yet it has only 25 local councils. Kano State, on the other hand, contributes effectively zero oil revenue to the Federation account, but it has 44 local governments. Because revenue is shared equally among local councils every single month, Kano routinely collects 44 portions of the shared wealth, while the region actually generating a massive chunk of that wealth collects just 25. The creation of these administrative units, it is fundamentally completely tied to resource extraction.
And this intense regional competition is deeply entrenched. I mean, it's baked right into the constitutional level. Take Section 318(1) of the 1999 Constitution. It defines an indigene of a state based on bloodline and ancestry, literally where your parents or grandparents are from, rather than where you actually live. Researchers are quick to point out that this directly contradicts other constitutional goals about free mobility. State and local governments use this indigent status to routinely discriminate against residents from other parts of the country when it comes to things like jobs, schools, and benefits. It essentially creates a bifurcated citizenship. It forces everyone to fiercely defend their ancestral region because at the end of the day, that is the only place their rights to resources are actually guaranteed.
So, when you combine a massively powerful central government, fierce ethno-regional competition, and laws that prioritize your ancestry over your residency, academics summarize the end result as market-distorting federalism. This is a system where normal economic forces, things like production, innovation, and efficiency, are completely overridden by clientelist politics. The entire political apparatus just becomes hyper-focused on how to arbitrarily divide and share existing wealth, mostly oil rents, rather than actually creating any new wealth.
Which brings us to our final thought. We've seen how just counting people started a massive crisis, how the central government hoards the wealth, and how the rules of distribution actually incentivize this bitter, endless regional competition. So the crucial question we're left with is this: how can a nation balance true wealth generation with equitable sharing without letting the very rules of the game fuel endless conflict? It is a monumental challenge of state building, and one that requires looking past the politics directly at the ledger. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it helped clarify some of the invisible systems at play here. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.